It is beginning to feel a bit like fall. So gorgeous leaves. The campus is beginning to sing in its fall voice. My name is Robert Francis. I'm Vice President for Academic and Student Affairs, and it gives me an incredible, great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Rachel David. Rachel is going to give a talk today on women and social protest. And I've had the honor to know Rachel since she first started teaching here. She came to us as a red-hot, young, nonprofit person who was very much in sync with the women's movement, the ideas of multiculturalism, and the idea of intersectionality. There's a whole list of stuff that she's interested in here. Some of them cause me to blush.
Don't have to read that.
Global gender issues, sexuality and intimate relationships. There's some oh, good. We have a class coming in that we are waiting for. So why don't we let them sort of come in, and then once they settle in, we'll continue on. So welcome, all of you who arrived a bit late. I'm Robert Francis. I'm Vice President for Academic and Student Affairs, and it is absolutely my delight. See, I got another verb in there for you, adjective in there for you, to introduce Rachel David. This is Rachel joined our faculty in the late 1990s. And she has her undergraduate degree from Berkeley in sociology, and she has her law degree from UW Seattle. She teaches women's studies, and she is very much involved in the issues surrounding equity and social justice, with a particular interest in women's roles in that area. I would consider to be her one of the leaders of the women's movement on campus, and she is also deeply involved, again, in many of the other equity and social justice issues here. So I give you Rachel David.
So thank you all for coming. I'm very excited to be here to talk about this topic. There are literally thousands of examples of women's social protests going on in the world right now, so let alone throughout history. I've chosen 3 organizations to talk to you about today, almost at random, because there's just so much that I could talk about. But I do think that these 3 organizations and the women behind them illustrate some of the themes around women and social protest globally today, so I'll try and highlight those as I go along. There's so many things to trip over right here. The first organization, that I want to talk about is Black Lives Matter. For those of you who've been living under a rock for the last couple years and have not heard of Black Lives Matter, I'll give you just a tiny snippet of history. The Black Lives Matter hashtag started as a response to the Trayvon Martin shooting in 2012 and the lack of accountability for his murderer, George Zimmerman, and grew from a hashtag to the streets and a full-blown nationwide movement after the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri by police officer Darren Wilson in 2014. This is probably not what most of you thought I would be talking about today. A lot of people don't imagine women's social protest in connection with Black Lives Matter. And I wanted to choose this organization for 2 reasons. First, women, when we think of women's social protest, what's most visible to us in this country are the protests and movements of the most privileged women in our culture. So in the US, that means white, heterosexual, cisgendered, middle and upper class, able-bodied women, and globally it means Western women. When you think about women in social protest, you probably think of images of women like these, Susan B. Anthony, Gloria Steinem, Bella Abzug, more lately, Emma Watson. And so I wanted to highlight the work of some of the women that we typically don't see. Most people who've heard of Black Lives Matter don't know that it was 3 queer Black women who started it. And one of the reasons why is also that in terms of movements for racial justice, it's typically men's activism that's most visible to us. So Black Lives Matter and the 3 women behind it also illustrate male privilege. The hashtag Black Lives Matter and other aspects of the movement and the organization have been hijacked and used without permission or attribution so that these 3 women, who are, by the way, Patrisse Cullors, Opal Tometi, and Alicia Garza from left to right, have been almost erased and invisible in this movement. And that's happened both in the mainstream media and within the movement itself. So that's what makes it important to me to highlight Black Lives Matter as women's activism. I want to tell you just a tiny bit about each of these 3 women so that we get to know them a little bit. Patrisse Cullors describes herself as an artist, organizer, freedom fighter, and the focus of her activism has been on police accountability. She's founder of an organization called Dignity and Power Now, which is dedicated to protecting incarcerated people and their families in Los Angeles. And I want to show you a short video that they have produced on their website that discusses the issue of building new prisons. The video, what I like about it is it's a person on the street video, and they ask people, what would you do with $2.3 billion? And people are talking about mostly helping the homeless, helping children, those kind of things, building schools, and then they ask them, would you build a prison? And everyone says, no, we don't need more prisons. And it's in response and protest to a proposal in LA County to build 2 new jails, which would cost the county $2.3 billion. So, and it does a little educating about the prison industrial complex and the movement against it. So it's 3 minutes long if you want to go watch it. So Opal Tometi, I love technology, don't you? Opal Tometi is the executive director of the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, which is the country's leading Black organization working on immigrant rights, and one of the only organizations in this country that's focused specifically on immigration issues in the Black population. Their most recent campaign helped win family reunification visas for Haitians displaced by the 2010 earthquake. And Alicia Garza is, she has served as the executive director of People Organized to Win Employment Rights, or POWER, in San Francisco. They worked on issues like free public transportation for youth, you know POWER, and gentrification in the city, profit-driven development, and police violence in Black neighborhoods. And now she's the special projects director for the National Domestic Workers Alliance. Domestic workers, the people who clean our homes and take care of our children, are overwhelmingly female. Many of them are undocumented. Most of them are women of color. And they're very, very vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. They have few legal protections. So this is an organization that's working for respect and recognition and legal protections for that group of people. So this is what social activism looks like and women's activism looks like in the United States today. It relies heavily on social media as a tool for change. And it also involves more traditional forms of protest. It uses art as a way of expression and community building to bring people together. It's also very intersectional. The concept of intersectionality was first put forward by Kimberly Crenshaw and later developed by Patricia Hill Collins, and she defines it as the idea that cultural patterns of oppression are not only interrelated, but are bound together and influenced by the intersectional systems of society, such as race, gender, class, and ethnicity. So this is the idea that we're not just affected by one of these systems at any given point, but by all of them working together in ways that sometimes benefit us and sometimes disadvantage us. So These movements today focus on what matter to women who are marginalized on the basis of race, class, sexual orientation, ability, immigration status, age, etc. In their words, the Black Lives Matter organization affirms the lives of Black, queer, and trans folks, disabled folks, Black undocumented folks, folks with records, women, and all Black lives along the gender spectrum. It centers those that have been marginalized within Black liberation movements. It's a tactic to rebuild the Black liberation movement. I did have a video from Opal Tometi talking about some of the impetus that she had in founding Black Lives Matter. And she talks about a broad spectrum of issues that they were trying to address. Really everything, all the ways in which systemic racism affects Black lives in the United States today. Okay, so the other thing that she talks about is that the 3 women who founded the Black Lives Matter were really affected by the fact that police brutality targeted and made vulnerable the lives of the men that they cared about, their brothers, their cousins, etc. So I think this also illustrates the fact that when women engage in social protests, they're often motivated to do so based on what's happening to people they care about. I don't believe in a universal women's experience around the world, but I do think that there are some common elements to being a woman that affect many, if not most, women around the world. And one of those is that we often put other people before ourselves. Our social training is often that we're supposed to care about other people and take care of those in our lives before we really take care of ourselves. And what that means is that women can often suffer greatly in their lives and not stand up or disrupt social norms, but when someone they love is suffering, that's when they'll start to take action. So I think Black Lives Matter also illustrates that dynamic. The second organization that I want to talk about is Musawa, which is a Muslim feminist organization. Musawa means equality in Arabic. And for some of you, again, this might be a surprise that there is such a thing as a Muslim feminist organization. I think our perceptions in the United States are often that those two terms are contradictory. But actually, Muslim feminism is hard to say, and it's been around for quite a while. The spark, there's kind of two events that were happening at the same time in 1979 that sparked a need for a particular kind of Islamic feminism. One of them was that globally, the United Nations adopted the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And that was really the beginning of a transnational women's movement. There have been definitely local and national and even regional women's movements, but this was the call for women to organize across the globe. And it also was the call for governments to start treating women as if they had human rights, which is, a nice thing. And also in 1979 was the Iranian Revolution and the beginning of political Islam. So women's rights activists were trying to organize around the world and going into Muslim countries and talking to women about their rights and finding that the women often used Islamic tradition and the laws of their country to sort of argue back with them and say, but doesn't the Quran say that a man can beat his wife? Doesn't the Quran say that a man can have 4 wives? Isn't this justified by our traditions and our laws? And there was also resistance because feminism was associated with the West, and the recent history of colonization in those countries made women very resistant to hearing people come and tell them about how their culture was wrong and this other way of doing things was better, and that these Western or perceived to be agents of the West were going to tell them how they should do it. That just felt a little too much like colonialism, and so there was a lot of resistance to hearing those messages. So this specific brand of Islamic feminism grew in response to those conflicts and issues. And Musawa is one organization. It's actually a more recent organization, but it was started by 12 women, one of whom is Ziba Mir Husseini, and she was actually born in Iran, so I thought she's a good example to talk about in terms of the founders of this organization and where they were coming from. She loved her country. She never intended to leave Iran, But she did want to learn English and get a degree, so in the 70s, she went to England to get her PhD in anthropology. The Iranian Revolution happened while she was gone, and she supported the revolution, as many Iranians did. And then also, like many Iranians, was surprised by the results and how her country changed when she returned in the 1980s. She really wanted to teach. She had her PhD. She wanted to work and teach, but because she didn't wear a head covering all the time, she wasn't allowed to work. She also was viewed as somewhat of a social pariah because she had lived on her own as a single woman in England for 6 years. And her marriage started to fall apart, and she wanted a divorce, but her husband refused to grant it to her, so she couldn't get it. So all of this motivated her to start to study family law and its connections to the Quran and basis in the Quran. And she successfully took her husband to court and challenged those laws and won a divorce. So then she was living in Iran as a woman who couldn't work, didn't always cover her head, had been living on her own in England, and had now divorced and challenged her husband in court. So that was not working out so well. So she left and went back to England, but has made it her life's work to research family law and Islamic tradition. And she discovered that many of the laws in Islamic countries are based in ancient interpretations of the Quran, and that she believes that those interpretations are coming from humans who are fallible and whose the cultural context changes so they can evolve. So she advocates for that. She says she believes God is just and, quote, a just God cannot discriminate against women. She's written a lot of books. These are some examples about Islamic law, Muslim tradition, and gender equality. So she started Musawa with 11 other women as a project of building knowledge, questioning some of these interpretations, and developing Quranic justifications for gender equality, and to empower women to push for legal changes in their countries on that basis. So using actually the Quran as a way of saying gender equality is in line with Islam, which gave a lot of women hope that they could push for equality, that they could push for change in their lives, that they could engage in social protests without giving up their religion. And that opened up huge amounts of participation for a lot of women. So I want to tell you a little bit about their work. I am no expert on Islam. I hope very much not to offend anyone. I'm going to use the words of Musawa and of Ziba Mirhuseni so that I don't mess anything up. So according to Mirhuseni, the Quran has more than 6,000 verses, and only 4 of them can be explained in a patriarchal way. 6,000 verses, 4 of them are patriarchal. So she questions why so many laws have been based out of those 4 verses. She believes that religious knowledge in the Islamic tradition has traditionally been the monopoly of men, and she wants women to be involved. She believes that knowledge and religious interpretation should be participatory. Everybody in the culture should be allowed to participate in that. So one example of an initiative to change interpretation is based on the concept of the husband's right to beat his wife that I mentioned earlier. There's a passage in the Quran that reads essentially, a disobedient or arrogant wife should first be advised by her husband, then forsaken in bed, and then beat. But the concept, the word that's traditionally been interpreted as to beat, can also be interpreted or read to mean to go separate ways. So that new interpretation or different interpretation of that verse has been used to actually allow women to end their marriages. So Musawa has been engaged in a 2-year, 10-country life stories project where they gather the stories of women and men and how their lives have been affected by different interpretations of the Quran. And in the world, Islamic feminism as a movement has had some pretty significant successes. So this, in 2004, after years of activism and protest on the part of women in Morocco. Did I say Morocco? This is Morocco. The parliament passed a law defining marriage as an equal partnership. gave women the right to divorce and protected them from a practice called talaq, which was the right of husbands to dissolve their marriage at will. This is actually a picture taken from a later social protest when women didn't think that law was being implemented strongly enough and took to the streets again to protest that. In Saudi Arabia, women have protested for the right to vote and the right to drive, and recently pushed for a law against domestic abuse, which they got. And the Arab Spring in 2011, young women were at the forefront of uprisings in Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen. They were often dubbed the Twitterati for using social media to organize, to document, to demand change in their countries, and to show the world what was going on. So as you can see from these two examples, technology and social media are really important tools for organizing and social protest today, and ones that women have embraced wholeheartedly. But women are also uniquely vulnerable online and in technology communities. And the threats faced by women in those contexts limit their potential and ability to use these tools. So an organization called Take Back the Tech is trying to address those threats. Take Back the Tech was started in 2006 by a group of young women in Southeast Asia. And what they saw as a problem was that the gendered violence that women are more vulnerable to in the physical world, rape, harassment, stalking, domestic violence, were being extended using technology. So there isn't a ton of research on online gendered violence, but from the research that we have, it's clear that women are uniquely vulnerable to these crimes and much more likely to experience them than men, things like cyber harassment and cyber stalking. Take Back the Tech has tried to document some of that. One of the ways they do that is with this interactive map. They collected 1,126 cases from 2012 to 2014, and you can check out this map and actually sort these cases by the type of harm or violation, the survivor strategy, age, country, all kinds of things. So technology is kind of a double-edged sword, right? It can be really empowering and liberating for women, but it also has a dark side as a tool of abuse and silencing and harassment. One example of this is cell phones. Cell phones can be used by abusers to track their victims through geolocation software that might be on the phone that sometimes victims aren't even aware are there. It's been used for people to stalk and even kill their partners after their partners have left them. But also they can be really amazing tools for empowerment, and sometimes domestic violence victims get a secret phone that their abuser isn't aware of and can use that to call the police for help or access other resources. We've also all seen how social media is an amazing tool for social change and protest, but Take Back the Tech did a report card of 3 different social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. This is not how we do averages for grades at Shoreline, so I'm not sure what formula they're using there, but, but you can see that these platforms didn't fare very well on this report card. So they evaluated them on transparency around reporting, accessibility of reporting, responsiveness to the needs of non-European and US women, engagement, proactive steps to eradicate violence against women, and a public commitment to human rights standards. These threats to women's safety and rights and the lack of accountability for them are rampant in the United States. Everywhere from the get back in the kitchen comment that's made on a social media platform in response to any woman who has an opinion about anything, to the cyber mob, death threats, rape threats that have been made against Anita Sarkeesian and through Gamergate to women who've wanted to just talk about the issue of sexism in video games. So imagine how much more significant these threats are in cultures where it's seen as unusual or even treacherous for women to speak out against sexist cultural norms. When women's role in a culture is very restricted, any social protest by women may be met with extreme violent backlash, and technology is being used as a tool for that. The Association for Progressive Communications carried out a study in 7 countries on technology-related violence against women. And I'm just going to show you one example, the country report from Pakistan, which was prepared by an organization called Bites for All Pakistan, found that women who advocated for women's rights and human rights in Pakistan faced tech-related violence, including rape threats, death threats, photoshopping their face onto pornographic images, creating false social media profiles like Facebook pages to disseminate false information about them, and publishing personal information like their home address, ID numbers, etc. And the 7-country report found that these kinds of gender-related crimes are not a priority for the police. The police don't take them seriously, and most countries have either no police unit focused on cybercrimes or a totally non-functioning unit focused on cybercrimes. Ironically, there's been a Twitter campaign against the Take Back the Tech hashtag, designed to hijack the hashtag, which has involved people who self-associate with Gamergate, posing threats to anyone involved in the Take Back the Tech community, using images that depict women being subjected to physical and sexual violence as an attempt to silence this group and anybody who associates with it. There have been more than 20,000 tweets containing anti-feminist, racist, violent, and abusive content directed at the organization. All the people involved, there have been threatening emails sent to people involved with the organization, as well as anybody who expresses support for this organization. So when women try to create safe spaces on the web, they are often targeted for that very act, using these tools of cyber harassment and cyber abuse. Take Back the Tech, though, I think this is from yesterday on their Twitter page, so it seems to be okay. They seem to have survived that. And they're attempting to reclaim digital spaces for the free and safe exercise of women's rights. They have lots of fact sheets available on their website. They have case studies from those 7 countries that illustrate cyber harassment and cyber violence. They have an archive of actions that people have taken around the world that people can adapt to their own culture and context and use themselves. They recently engaged in a campaign to bring more global awareness to this issue in the context of the Beijing Plus 20 platform, and got cyber violence included in the general statement from that aspect of the UN. So I hope that these examples have been interesting. I really hope that you explore the resources here, learn more about these people and these movements. One way to do that is taking my class, Gender and Global Justice, shameless promotion, which will be offered next fall, and it's a fully online class. But I also hope that you can see that regular people can be involved in these kinds of campaigns. These are they're not any different from you. They're just regular folks who care about an issue. Getting involved in social protests can also be really fun. It can be really empowering. So I encourage you all to find something you care about and just get involved in whatever way feels comfortable to you. Also, before I take questions, I want to let people know that there's an amazing example of women in social protest that's going to be happening in this room right after this, called the Raging Grannies. They're awesome. So another way you can learn more about this is just to stay where you are for the next hour. Okay, thanks.
So we're going to take questions now. So if you have a question, we ask that you would come forward and speak into the microphone, because we are recording the event. 20. So if anyone has a question, this is your chance to come on up here and ask your question. Keep it short, because we want to get as many as you can. We don't want statements, okay? So come on up.
My voice projects quite well.
No.
It's for the video.
But I can't hear with my camera.
Huh?
But I need the microphone.
Okay, all right. Just a comment, very quick comment. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you very much. It's good to have the intellectual part of the movement and to show the intersectionality of gender, race, classes, the global economic part of it. I'm part of 2 of the 3, and I'm proud to say that. The flip side to that is when you are actively involved and actively engaged in it at a personal and professional level, it doesn't translate over academically. And as somebody who's used to taking the lumps of being someone who's actively engaged in social activism at many different levels, it's hard to take the academic, intellectual side of it and show by action and by doing. And when you actually do that, so, as we call it, walk the talk, a lot of people are very, very, how can I say it, uniquely dismissive, because it's like, that's not the way we do that here, we don't want to hear that, we don't want to know about it. However, it is necessary, not just as part of academic, it's part of life. And if it doesn't affect you personally, it will affect you some kind of way, whether it's you, yourself, or your loved one.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, well, I'll do one more quick plug. There's a Feminist United Club on this campus. So if you want to talk more about any of the issues that I talked about today, the club, I'm so proud of them. I'm the advisor for the club, and for the last year and a half that they've been active, they've been really intersectional in their focus, and I'm just so proud of the students who are involved in that club. We meet at 11:30 on Mondays in room 2346. So please join us. Oh, a question.
What level of unemployment affects the problems, especially in some of the Mideastern countries? Is that a factor in the issue, or not so much?
Yeah, well, employment and unemployment affect women's involvement in social protests. Is that your question?
I guess it's more in the line of lack of employment for men, giving them too much time to dwell on their status in the world.
There's so many different places to go with that question. I'm not even sure where to start. There's some interesting work that's been done around masculinity and male privilege, and in this country and in many other countries around the world, that the idea is that when men are raised with the expectation that it's their birthright to certain privileges, and one of those is often the right to gainful employment and to be able to get a job where they're going to be able to provide for their family. Nobody else in the family would have to work. When men then are not achieving that, what they assume to be just their right as men, that those men then kind of assert their masculinity through another way that makes them look or be perceived as real men, which can be violence. It can be violence against women specifically. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
I would like to ask a question if I could. Rachel, I don't know if you're all familiar with demonstration politics during the anti-war movement or the Black Power movement of the 60s and the 70s, but I understand what little bit I've done on that the role of women was very differently, and they were treated very differently by men in those movements. Can you speak to that at all?
Yes. So that is, I think, an accurate perception for many women who were involved in those movements. Many of them have told their stories and talked about not only being treated as sort of second-class citizens within the movements, being asked to provide the coffee, for example, for a meeting, and then just sort of sit quietly in the corner, but also being assumed to be, for the men of the movement, to have sexual access to those women as well. And the women's involvements in those, so when I said earlier that women often, their impetus for social protest and for taking action is because someone they care about has been affected. The women's movement in this country was really born out of women's involvement in movements that had to do with people they cared about. So women who were involved in the anti-war movement, who were involved in the Black liberation movement, in the civil rights movements, were really participating, many of them on behalf of the men that they loved, because they saw the men they loved being affected negatively by those dynamics. And then they participated in these movements and they realized, oh, we need a movement too. this is not okay what's going on. So the second wave of the women's movement in this country in the 60s and 70s, many of those women had been active in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement and didn't like the way they were treated within those movements. And I think we hear the echoes of that in the Black Lives Matter statement about we want to center marginalized people who've not just been marginalized in our society, but been marginalized within that Black liberation movement and make them the focus of the work that we do.
Any other questions? So let's please, everybody give another round of applause to Rachel David. And we will